The wind in Coyote Canyon had teeth, and it used them. It was not yet dawn in the Arizona Territory, just the first smear of bruised purple in the east, and the wind was already busy, scraping sand and alkali dust across the hard pan. It found the loose corner of a tin sheet on the roof of Pritchard's trading post and made it scream, a high, thin noise like a dying rabbit, behind the trading post, shielded from the worst of the gale by a single set of rickety wooden steps. May Caldwell was curled into herself. She was 27 years old, though the grit and the hunger had carved at least 10 more onto her face. Her clothes, once a respectable calico dress, were now just layered rags, stiff with dirt and sweat. She slept in the way of the hunted, not with the peace of the tired, but with the shallow, exhausted stillness of an animal that expects to be startled. One hand was thrust deep into the pocket of her thin coat, and the other was wrapped tight around the canvas strap of a satchel pulled against her stomach. Tucked inside that satchel, its corner sharp against her ribs, was a battered ledger book. She did not hear the man approach. His boots made almost no sound on the packed earth. Ellis Rourke moved like a man who believed noise was a form of waste. At 34, he was the proprietor of a failing ranch up on Confluence Ridge, a place as lonely as its owner. He was lean, dressed in serviceable denim trousers and a flannel shirt worn thin at the elbows. He held a tin plate. Steam rose from a mound of pinto beans, dark with molasses, and beside it sat a thick wedge of cornbread, yellow as a sunflower. He stopped a few feet away. His dog, a blue-gray cattle dog with one watchful brown eye and one of chipped ice blue, had flanked him. The dog, Juniper, settled onto her haunches, her gaze fixed on the sleeping woman. Ellis looked at her for a long moment. He saw the hollows in her cheeks, the raw chafe of the wind on her knuckles. He saw the way her whole body was a knot, braced even in sleep. He bent at the knees, a slow, deliberate movement, and set the plate down on the dirt by the bottom step, well within her reach but not so close as to seem a threat. He was straightening up when the side door of the trading post swung open, spilling yellow lamplight and the sour smell of whiskey onto the ground. A drunk, one of Pritchard's early morning layabouts, stumbled out, blinking. He weaved toward the steps, missed his footing, and his boot heel struck May's foot. It was not a hard kick, but it was enough. May didn't wake up. She exploded. She was on her feet in a single, uncoiling motion, slamming her back against the rough wood of the trading post, her hand flying from her pocket. She held no weapon, just a fist, but her eyes were wide and feral, her breath hissing through chapped lips. She was a cornered thing, ready to scratch and bite and die. The drunk gaped, sobered by the sudden violence. Juniper, the dog, was up now, a low, menacing rumble building in her chest, directed not at May, but at the man who had kicked her. Ellis Rourke didn't raise his voice. He didn't even look at the drunk. His eyes were on May. "Eat," he said. The word was short, flat. "No one's watching." The drunk, hearing the quiet authority in that voice and seeing the dog's lifted lip, suddenly found business elsewhere. He scrambled away, muttering, and disappeared around the front of the building. May's chest was still heaving. Her gaze darted from Ellis to the dog, to the plate of food on the ground. It was a trap. It had to be. Nothing was free. From far off, a sound cut through the wind. It was the long, lonely cry of a steam engine, the Gila Pacific Line, making its way toward Benson. The sound was a promise of civilization to some, but to the people who knew these valleys, it was the sound of an iron centipede, chewing up the old land, spitting out new rules, new owners, and new kinds of trouble. The main door of the trading post opened. Mr. Pritchard, a man whose face looked like a dried apple, peered out. He held a broom. "Get on," he snapped. Seeing May, "I run a place of business, no vagrants." Ellis didn't turn. He just stood there, a tall, quiet obstacle. Pritchard grumbled, his eyes shifting from Ellis to May and back. He was a man who knew which fights to pick, and Ellis Rourke, though poor, was not one of them. "Well, don't let her linger. Bad for business." He started to turn, then paused, pulling an envelope from his apron pocket. He glanced around, shoved it quickly under a loose shingle by the doorframe, a movement meant to be secret, but May's eyes, sharpened by desperation, tracked it. She saw the stamp. It was a dark blue eagle, the official seal of the Gila Pacific Rail Office. May Caldwell went perfectly still. The wind, the hunger, the man had all vanished. There was only that envelope. The feral fear in her eyes was instantly banked, replaced by something colder, something with a sharp, bitter taste of hatred. She knew that stamp. She knew what it meant. It meant stolen water, forged maps, and broken lives. Pritchard shuffled back inside, pulling the door shut with a decisive click. The moment was broken. Ellis looked at May. He had seen the change in her, the shift from hunted animal to something else, something harder. He didn't understand it, but he acknowledged it. He unhooked a woolen scarf from his belt. It was rough, dyed a dark indigo, and it smelled faintly of wood smoke. He tossed it, not at her, but onto the steps near the plate. "Nights get cold," he said. "Just that." He gave a soft whistle. Juniper fell back, padding silently to his heel. He turned and began to walk away, his long, slow stride eating up the ground. He didn't look back until he'd reached the corner of the building. He paused there, a silhouette against the rising, dusty light. He saw May, still frozen against the wall, but she was shivering now, a deep, uncontrollable tremor that shook her from head to toe. Then he was gone. May waited. She counted to 100, her teeth chattering. No one came. The wind howled. The smell from the plate, the rich, smoky salt of the beans, the sweet grit of the corn was torture. Her stomach cramped, a vicious, burning knot. She hadn't eaten anything warm in 3 days. Slowly, like a deer approaching a salt lick, she slid down the wall. She snatched the scarf first, wrapping it around her neck, burying her nose in the coarse, warm wool. It felt like an anchor. Then, her eyes still scanning the alley, she grabbed the plate. She retreated to the darkest shadow beneath the steps and ate. She used her fingers, scooping the beans and bread into her mouth with a desperate, mechanical speed. It wasn't food. It was life. It was heat. It was a single, defiant moment of comfort in a world that offered none. When the plate was clean, scraped bare by her fingernail, she set it down. The shivering had eased. The hard knot of hunger in her gut had softened. She pulled her satchel into her lap, her hand resting on the ledger book inside. She looked up, past the roof of the trading post, toward the high, remote line of Confluence Ridge. The mountains were a deep, bruised purple in the new light. The man was long gone, just a shadow returning to the stone. May Caldwell sat in the dirt, warm for the first time in days, and watched the empty path where he had been. May Caldwell had not always been a shadow. She had been a woman of numbers, of sharp pencils and straight lines. In Benson, she was known for her hand, a precise, elegant script that filled the ledgers of the Gila Pacific Railroad Surveying Office. She was a trusted ledger clerk, the one who translated the cryptic field notes of the surveyors into the grand, official maps that decided the fate of the territory. And that was how she knew. She knew that Survey Marker 17, the one that was supposed to define the northern boundary of the Pima agricultural rights, had drifted 2 miles north on the official filing. 2 miles, a small change of ink, and suddenly, the silver thread spring. The only reliable water in that entire basin belonged not to the dozens of small ranchers who depended on it, but to the Gila Pacific, or rather, to the man who sat on the Gila Pacific's board and held the land grant deeds Commissioner Byron Kells. Kells was a builder, a man of vision, or so the newspapers in Tucson claimed. He built with ink and legislation, a far more devastating combination than dynamite and steel. He used the law like a club, and where the law was inconvenient, he simply had it rewritten in his private ledgers. May had seen the transfers, the payments to surveyors for hardship posting that coincided perfectly with the discovery of new, more convenient land boundaries. She had said nothing. It was not her business. Her business was the numbers and keeping quiet. and using her salary to care for her younger brother, Toby was 17, all elbows and misplaced optimism, a boy who still believed that the world was, at its core, a fair place. May had tried to protect him from the truth. Then Kells, on a tour of the Benson office, had seen him. Kells, a man who collected things land, power. And people had offered Toby a scholarship, an opportunity. He called it a place at a fine industrial school in the East. All expenses paid by the railroad. May had refused. Toby was all she had. A week later, a county judge, a man who owed his position to Kells, declared May an unsuitable guardian for a minor. Toby was taken by two men in dark suits and put on a train. It was all legal. It was all perfectly documented. He was sent away, not to a fine school, but to an indentured labor program, a place so distant and so tightly controlled that the one letter she received was a smudge of censored ink, and then nothing. The letters she sent were returned. The inquiries she filed vanished. He was gone, absorbed by the same ink that had stolen the silver thread. That was when the quiet clerk in the surveying office became something else. Her grief and rage found a focus. She began to work late. She was no longer just a clerk. She was an archaeologist. She dug back through the old field notes, the ones from before Kells, the ones stored in the dusty basement archives. She found the original survey points, the true markers. And with her fine, precise hand, she began to copy them, one by one, into a small, cheap ledger book of her own. She was not a thief. She was a restorer. She presented her findings, not to Kells, but to the territorial marshal. 2 days later, the marshal was transferred, and that same afternoon, May Caldwell was accused of stealing $300 from the office cash box. The evidence was irrefutable. 2 clerks, both on Kells' payroll, had seen her. A search of her desk revealed $20 of the stolen money. She knew. Then, she knew the map she had made was not a piece of evidence. It was a death warrant. She left Benson that night with the clothes on her back, the indigo scarf from her brother, and the small, vital ledger book that was now her only reason for living. She was running, not just from the noose, but toward the one impossible thing she had left justice. The man who found her behind the trading post, Ellis Rourke, knew nothing of this. His world was not one of ink and ledgers, but of dust and loss. Confluence Ridge was less a ranch than a memory of one. The land was high and brittle, the grass worn down to nubs. The house was solid, built of river stone, but it was silent. The silence was the loudest thing about it. 3 years ago, the smallpox had come through and the silence had settled in for good. It had taken his wife, Sarah, leaving behind only a scent of lavender and a half-finished quilt. After that, the drought had come, as if the land itself was grieving, or perhaps just giving up. It sucked the color from everything. The springs dried, the cattle thinned. Ellis was now a man of diminishing returns. He had 20 head of tough, stringy cattle, the dog, and a perimeter of fences that were more gaps than barriers. He worked from sunup to sundown, not to get ahead, but simply to not fall further behind. He was a man of immeasurable patience and profound, unspoken loneliness. He didn't talk because there was no one to talk to, and he had long ago forgotten how to talk to himself. He came back to the trading post at dusk. He had a small list of supplies, salt, coffee beans, and a new handle for his axe. He saw the tin plate, stacked neatly on the bottom step, wiped clean. He hadn't expected it. He looked toward the shadows behind the steps, the place where the wind couldn't cut so deep. She was still there. She had not run. She was hunched over, her back to the wall, the blue scarf wrapped around her head. She looked even smaller than she had at dawn. Ellis went inside. He bought his supplies from Pritchard, ignoring the man's sour look. He paid for a full pot of coffee, the thick, black, scalding kind Pritchard kept on the stove. He took the pot and a clean tin cup and went back outside. He set the pot on the step, next to where the plate had been. The metal was hot, and the smell of it, rich and smoky, cut through the dusty air. May watched him. She had been weighing her options, The border. She could make it to Mexico in 4 days, maybe 3, if she pushed. South. That was the only direction. But this man, he had given her food. He had left. He had come back. He had brought coffee. The first act was charity. The second was a question. Trust was a luxury she had traded for survival, along with her name, her home, and her brother. She was about to speak, to tell him to leave, to tell him she wanted nothing, when she heard it. The sound of horses. It was not the slow, ambling walk of a rancher's mount. It was the confident, rhythmic beat of professional riders, men who lived in the saddle. 2 men rode down the center of the dusty street. They wore long coats, despite the mild evening. Their hats were pulled low. They moved with an arrogant, easy slouch. But their eyes, she knew, were sharp. They were scanning, taking inventory of the street. One of them, a thick-bodied man with a scar that pulled his lip into a permanent sneer, was Red Nolan. The other, thinner, weasel-faced, was Sykes Bell. She knew their names from the whispers in the Benson office. They were Kells's men, not the ones in suits, but the ones who came after, the bounty hunters. May stopped breathing. She tried to make herself smaller, to melt into the wood and the shadow. Ellis was standing by his wagon, not 10 feet away. He was tying a loose rope, his back to the street. He heard the horses, and he paused, but he did not turn. Nolan and Bell reined in, their horses dancing a little. They looked at the trading post, at Ellis's wagon, at the deep shadows by the steps. Bell, the thin one, gestured with his chin. "See that red skulker in the dark?" May's heart stopped. Before Nolan could answer, Ellis Rourke moved. It was not a sudden act. He simply finished with his rope, and then turned, slowly, to face the street. He did not look at May. He did not look at the hunters. He looked at the sky, as if judging the weather. But in turning, his tall frame, broad even in its leanness, moved directly into the line of sight between the riders and the steps. He blocked her. He became a wall. Nolan's eyes, cold and assessing, swept over Ellis. They saw a rancher, worn down, his boots scuffed, his wagon old, nothing of consequence. Ellis let his gaze drop from the sky and settle on the 2 riders. He did not glower. He did not threaten. He just looked. His eyes, May could see even from her shadow, were not brown and warm. They were the color of the high, cold iron of a winter wind. They were empty of fear and full of something hard and unyielding. Nolan held the look for a beat. Then, too, he was a man who enjoyed making others look away. Ellis did not look away. It was Bell who broke the silence, shifting in his saddle. "Just a farmer. Red, let's get a drink." Nolan spat into the dust. "Right." He turned his horse, and the 2 men dismounted, tying their reins to the hitching post in front of the saloon. 2 doors down. They were here. They were staying. May let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Her hands were shaking so hard she had to clench them. Ellis stood for a moment longer. Then, as if nothing had happened, he moved to his wagon seat. He picked up the reins. May made the calculation in a fraction of a second. The night was coming. The hunters were here. She knew them. They would drink. They would ask questions. And then they would search. They would find her. Staying here in the open was death. Running south to Mexico was death. This man, this silent stranger with the cold eyes and the kind gestures, was an unknown. He was a third way. She stood up, pulling the indigo scarf tight. She grabbed her satchel. If she stayed outside tonight, she would be caught. If she followed this man, she might live. And as she looked at the Gila Pacific envelope still tucked under Pritchard's shingle, a new, cold, and terrible thought emerged. Kells was coming for this land. 2. The railroad was chewing its way west. This rancher, with his failing land, was in the path. She could see it, a map in her head. She wasn't just a fugitive. She was a weapon. And maybe, just maybe, she could drag them all into a trap. She stepped out of the shadows, her face pale but her eyes set. Ellis Rourke watched her approach in the dim light. He said nothing. He just waited. The wagon ride was a long, jolting climb out of the canyon. The wheels screeched on the axle, a sound that set May's teeth on edge. But Ellis Rourke seemed not to hear it. He just drove, his hands light but firm on the reins, his gaze fixed on the high, barren ridge ahead. They passed no one. The land was empty, scoured by the wind, dotted with skeletal ocotillo and drought-withered sage. Rourke Ranch was not a ranch. It was a declaration of war against gravity and thirst. The house was built of river stone, solid and square, hunkered against the wind. The barn, however, listed to one side, its timbers gray and cracked. The corral fence was a patchwork of new pine and rotted, silvered posts. Everything was either meticulously repaired or in a state of terminal decay. There was no in-between. Ellis pulled the wagon to a halt near the barn. Juniper, the cattle dog, leapt from the wagon bed before it even stopped, trotting to a patch of shade by the water trough. "The loft in the barn is dry," Ellis said, not looking at her. He pointed with his chin. "Hay is clean. Water's in the trough. Pump is by the house. You'll be safe from the wind." May looked at the barn, then back at him. "What am I?" His head turned, his cold iron eyes settling on her. "What am I, a prisoner or a guest? You're neither." He wrapped the reins around the brake handle and climbed down, his movements economical. "You're here. The deal is this. You work for your keep. I've got 100 repairs and no hands. You mend, you cook, you work. You earn your place. When you're ready to leave, you leave. I won't stop you." He turned and walked toward the house, adding over his shoulder, "But you pull your weight, starting now. The stalls in there haven't been mucked in 3 days. The shovel's by the door." May watched him go. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask her story. He had offered her the one thing she hadn't had in months. A simple, brutal transaction. Labor for safety. She slid from the wagon seat, her legs stiff. The indigo scarf was still around her neck. She tightened the knot and walked toward the barn. The next days fell into a rhythm defined not by conversation, but by work. The silence between her and Ellis was as vast and unbroken as the land around them. May worked until her hands, already raw, cracked and bled. She mucked the stalls, her stomach churning at the smell, but she finished the job. She took the shovel, found the loose, splintered boards of the water trough, and, using tools she found in the barn, began the slow process of mending them. She was not good at it. The hammer felt alien in her hand, and she struck her thumb twice, the pain a sharp, blinding white, but she did not stop. Ellis watched her. Sometimes he would be coming from the small pasture, his face grim, and he would pause, watching her fight with a warped piece of wood. He never offered to help. He just watched, his face unreadable, and then moved on. She learned to patch the shingle roof of the lean-to, a perilous job that had her balancing on heat-warped timbers, the wind trying to peel her off like a sticker. She learned to use the pump without flooding the mechanism, to bank the fire in the kitchen stove, to grind the coffee beans. On the 3rd day, as she sat on the barn step trying to coax a splinter from her palm with a needle, Juniper trotted up. The dog, who had until then regarded her with the same watchful neutrality as her master, dropped a smooth, heavy piece of cottonwood at her feet. May froze. The dog whined, a low, impatient sound, and nudged the wood with her nose. Hesitantly, May reached down, her movements slow, so as not to spook the animal. She picked up the stick. It was warm from the sun. Juniper's entire body began to wag, a frantic, joyful quiver. The dog backed up, dropping into a play bow. May looked from the dog to the empty ranch. She looked at her own hands, filthy and bleeding. A small, strange, and unfamiliar feeling bubbled in her chest. It was a muscle she had not used in so long she had forgotten its name. She drew her arm back and threw the stick. It wasn't a good throw, end over end. But Juniper bounded after it with a yelp of pure delight, when the dog brought it back and dropped it, demanding a second round. May Caldwell smiled. It was the first time in nearly a year. It was a small, cracked and rusty thing. That smile. But it was real. The silence between the two humans remained, but the soundscape of the ranch changed. There was the constant, rhythmic tap-tap-tap of May's hammer. There was the shush of the wind through the high grama grass, and now there was the occasional, sharp bark of the dog and May's low, quiet command, "Go get it." The first real change came a week later. Ellis was in the main room of the stone house, which served as his kitchen, parlor, and office. He had an old territorial map, brittle and yellowed, spread on the plank table. He was staring at it, his frustration a palpable thing in the air. The auxiliary well, he said, so suddenly it made May jump. She was at the sink, washing grit from a pot of beans. It should be there. He tapped the map. My father sunk it. I've dug 3 test holes. Nothing but dust. May dried her hands on a rag and moved closer. She looked at the map. It was a crude, hand-drawn thing. Where did you get this? It was my father's. May stared at it. She looked past the ink, to the landmarks he had sketched in. Coyote Narrows, the Three Sisters Rock Formation, the dry wash. She closed her eyes for a moment, not seeing the map, but seeing the land as she had from the wagon. She was seeing it through her surveyor's memory. "This is wrong," she said, her voice quiet. Ellis looked up. "This map, it's wrong. Your father drew this bend in the wash as a true curve, but it's not. It's a switchback. And he marked this ridgeline based on magnetic north, not true north. The surveyors for the county did that in the 1870s to save time. It's lazy." She picked up a piece of charcoal from the hearth. "He didn't miss, he just measured wrong." She turned the map over and began to draw on the back. Her hand, so clumsy with the hammer, was now a thing of grace and precision. The lines she drew were clean. Sure. She sketched the landscape from memory, adding elevation, noting the grade. The Gila Pacific surveys, the old ones, they used the sun and the stars. They had to be accurate. She remembered the markers. I'm 38, I'm 39. She tapped the new map. "Your well isn't here." She pointed to his mark. "It's here, 100 yards northeast, on the far side of the basalt cropping." Ellis stared at the new map. He stared at the sureness of her hand. He saw the charcoal on her fingers. And then he looked at her. Truly looked at her. For the first time, he was not seeing a vagrant. He was seeing an educated woman. He was seeing something that did not belong, something as out of place as a law book in a saloon. He said nothing. He just folded the new map, slid it into his pocket, and walked out. 2 hours later, she heard the sound, the rhythmic, steady clank thud of the pump. She walked to the door. Ellis was standing by the basalt cropping, 100 yards away. Water, dark and muddy, but undeniably wet, was gushing into a newly dug hole. That night, they ate in silence, as usual. But the air was different. When the meal was done, May went to her satchel, which she never let out of her sight. She pulled out the small, string-bound ledger. She placed it on the table between them. Ellis looked at the book, then at her. "Don't open it," she said, her voice low and firm. "It's not for you." He waited. "I am being hunted. For this." She tapped the cover. "If I am gone one morning, if I disappear, or if you find me, if I am dead, I want you to do one of 2 things." His eyes never left hers. "Burn it. Burn it until it's ash. Or get it to a federal judge, Lucretia Baird. In Prescott. No one else. Tell him she will know what it means." Ellis Rourke looked at the book. He looked at the woman who had found his water, who had mended his trough, who had smiled at his dog. He had offered her safety in exchange for work. She was now offering him a choice in exchange for her life. He nodded. Just once. A short, sharp dip of his chin. He accepted the terms. He did not touch the book, and May took it, sliding it back into her satchel. That night, May lay in the hayloft, the wind screaming over the roof. She heard a new sound from the house, a dry, hacking cough. It was deep, rattling. The sound of a man who had breathed in too much dust, too much drought. Ellis. She lay awake, listening to it. It was a sound of weakness, of vulnerability, and it terrified her more than his silence. Before dawn, she was in the main house. She moved without a sound. She found the tin of dried herbs she had seen on a high shelf. Mullein, good for the lungs. She steeped a handful in a cup of boiling water, creating a thick, bitter tea. She set the steaming tin cup on the floor outside his closed bedroom door. She did not knock. She did not call his name. She just left it and returned to the barn as the first light hit the ridge. When she came in for breakfast, the cup was on the washing up board, empty. Ellis was at the stove, frying bacon. He didn't turn. "In the desert," he said, his voice rough from the coughing. "Trust is fine, a good thing to have, maybe." He turned. He was holding her empty cup in one hand. In the other, he held a knife. It was a dagger, really, the handle made of dark horn. The blade 6 inches long, sharpened to a razor edge. He set it on the table, next to her plate. "But steel," Ellis Rourke said, "is better." May looked at the knife. It was a gift, an acceptance, a warning. It was the most eloquent thing he had ever said. She picked it up, tested the weight. It was balanced. She slid it into her boot. As she did, a sound, faint and mournful, carried on the wind from the canyon below. The long, wailing whistle of the Gila Pacific. A rumor she'd heard at Pritchard's trading post came back to her. A new spur line. Kells's pet project. They called it. A line to cut straight through the high country, straight through Confluence Ridge. May looked out the window, toward the parched pasture where Ellis Rourke's cattle were grazing. She saw the new well, the one she had found, and she knew, with the cold certainty of a surveyor, what a railroad spur line really meant. It meant Kells was coming. It meant he would need to divert water, to seize land, to clear the way. And Ellis Rourke, a man with a failing ranch and a legitimate, but unrecorded, claim to the only water on the ridge, was directly in the path. She looked at the knife in her boot, and then at the satchel holding her ledger. She had been running from the history of the silver thread. Now, it was coming to find her. And she made a silent, cold vow. It would not happen again. Not here. Not to this man. The sky turned yellow 5 hours before sundown. It was not a color, but a sickness. The wind, which had been a constant, whining companion, fell utterly silent. The air grew thick, heavy, and still. Even the insects stopped chirring. "Get to the house," Ellis said. He was standing by the corral, looking south. May, who was restitching a leather strap, looked up. "What is it?" "Dust." It did not come gradually. It arrived like a solid wall, a roiling, brown-black cliff that instantly erased the horizon, and then the mountains, and then the pasture. The world vanished. The wind struck with the force of a physical blow. A deafening, continuous roar that sounded like a freight train passing an inch from her ear. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in a minute. Sand and grit hit the stone house like handfuls of shot. "The barn!" Ellis yelled, his voice instantly snatched away by the gale. "The horses!" He was already running, his head down, one arm shielding his face. May didn't hesitate. She tied the indigo scarf over her nose and mouth, the knife he had given her secure in her boot, and plunged into the brown chaos after him. The 30 yards to the barn felt like a mile. The air was so thick with dust she couldn't breathe. She was chewing the grit. She found him at the main barn door. The wind had caught the heavy timber and was trying to rip it from its hinges. The noise was a series of explosive cracks, like gunfire. "The top hinge is gone," he shouted, shoving his shoulder against the wood. The door bucked, throwing him back. The wind screamed through the new gap, a high-pitched shriek. "Together on 3. May slammed her shoulder against the wood next to his. The door was a living, malevolent thing, fighting them with the full force of the storm. "Now!" he roared. They shoved. For a moment, nothing. Then, slowly, the wood groaned, moving inches. "The crossbar!" Ellis yelled, his mouth next to her ear. "I'll hold it, you slide the bar." He put his back fully against the door, a desperate, straining brace. May scrambled in the near-total darkness, her hands searching for the heavy piece of 4x4 that served as the lock. She found it, its surface gritty with sand. It was heavy, awkward. She tried to lift it into the iron brackets. The door slammed back, knocking her off her feet. "Again!" Ellis yelled, his voice strained. She got up, planting her feet. She could feel the vibration of his body through the wood, the immense strain he was under. She lifted the bar again, fumbling for the bracket. The door gave a violent shudder, and the wind found a new purchase. Ellis was sliding, his boots digging for traction in the dirt. He was going to lose it. The door would be ripped away, and the whole barn would be next. May dropped the bar and threw herself, not at the bar, but at the door, wedging her shoulder next to his, adding her own weight. "Both of us!" she screamed. "Push, then I'll set it." They held it together, a silent, desperate battle. Ellis grunted, and they gained an inch. "Now, May, now." He took the full weight alone. May grabbed the bar. Her hands were raw, her knuckles scraping against the bracket. She felt his hands, large and rough, suddenly cover hers, guiding the wood. His touch was not a touch. It was a brand, hot and certain even in the freezing wind. Together, they rammed the crossbar home. It held. The immediate, violent slamming stopped, replaced by a deep, vibrating boom as the wind hammered the secured door. They stood there for a second, shoulder to shoulder in the roaring dark, both gasping for air that was more dust than oxygen. His hand was still on top of hers on the crossbar. It was the first time they had touched for more than a fleeting second. His hand was calloused, strong, and in that moment, it was an anchor. Then he pulled away. "Check the horses." The storm raged for 2 days. They lived in a world of brown twilight and ceaseless noise. They holed up in the stone house, the windows caulked with rags, a candle guttering on the table. The grit found its way in everywhere. It was in their food, in their hair, in their teeth. On the second night, the wind finally began to ease. The roar became a whine, then a whisper. They were cleaning, sweeping a layer of fine silt from the floor. Ellis stopped, looking at May. The scarf she had worn was caked with mud. "Your neck," he said. She touched it. The scarf had chafed her skin raw. "Sit." He brought a bowl of water and a small tin of salve. He wet a clean rag and gently, almost clinically, wiped the grit from her skin. May sat frozen. It was the first gentle touch she had known in longer than she could remember. He picked up the clean indigo scarf she had washed, the one he had first given her. "You tied it wrong," he said, his voice gruff. "You let the wind in." He looped it around her neck. His fingers were large, calloused from work, and they moved with a surprising, almost clumsy delicacy. He was a man accustomed to mending fences and hauling rock, not tying scarves. He fumbled the knot, his knuckles brushing her jaw. The touch was electric. May let out a small, short breath. It was almost a laugh. She had forgotten what a laugh felt in her throat. It was a rusty sound. She ducked her head, hiding her face behind the brim of her hat. Suddenly shy, he finished the knot, his hands retreating as if they'd been burned. "There," he said. "That will hold." They worked on their gear. May was cleaning her boots, but the leather was stiff and her hands were aching. She pulled off her work gloves, flexing her fingers. Ellis, who was sharpening a knife by the fire, went still. He was looking at her wrist. She followed his gaze. There, on the pale skin of her inner wrist, was a fine white line. It was a perfectly straight, thin scar. May instinctively pulled her sleeve down. The scar was a keepsake from Benson, from the deputy who had put the railroad cuffs on her, pulling them one notch too tight, just as he'd been told. Ellis did not ask. He didn't say a word. He looked at the scar, then at her face, and his own expression, usually so guarded, tightened for just a second. He saw the fear in her eyes, the shame. He simply stood, went to the small box where he kept medical supplies, and came back. He placed a roll of clean, white linen bandage on the table next to her, not for the scar, which was long healed, but for her hands, for the work. It was an apology. It was an acknowledgement. It was everything he could not say. That night, the air was clean and cold. The storm had scoured the sky, which was now a deep, endless black, brilliant with stars. They sat by the fire, the silence comfortable for the first time. They were on opposite sides of the hearth, a safe, respectful distance. Juniper, who had spent the storm pressed against Ellis's legs, now lay in the middle, her head resting squarely on May's boot. Ellis noted the dog's betrayal with a flicker of a smile. After a while, he reached for a dusty, 5-string banjo that was propped in the corner. He wiped it down, tightened a string. He was not a musician. He played with a slow, unpracticed hand. He picked out a few simple, mournful chords, the notes hanging in the warm, quiet air. It was an old tune, one without words. May recognized the bones of it. It was a song from the mountains, from Appalachia, a place her own grandmother had come from. She listened to him play it through once. The second time, she began to hum, a low sound in her throat. Ellis's hands faltered. He looked up, surprised. She nodded, a small encouragement. He started again. This time, she sang. Her voice was not pretty. It was husky, cracked from the dust, low and untrained. But it was clear, and it was true. "Oh, the hills are cold, and the river's dry," she sang, the words coming back to her from a long-forgotten childhood. "And my true love's gone, on the morning tide." They finished the song together. Ellis set the banjo down, carefully. They looked at each other. The glance held, longer than was necessary. Her defenses, always so high, were lowered. His shoulders, always braced against the next loss, were relaxed. Their breathing was in sync. The quiet, even rhythm of two people who were no longer guarding themselves against the other. The fire popped, sending a spray of sparks. The spell was broken. "I should check the horses," May murmured, standing up. "I'll come," he said, standing with her. They walked to the barn, their boots crunching on the damp, clean swept earth. The repaired door was holding fast. The moon was so bright it cast sharp, black shadows. They stood by the barn door. In the silence, the horses shifted inside, a soft, comforting sound. "The air is clear," she said, looking up at the stars. "For now." He turned to her. He was standing very close, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him, close enough that she could see the flecks of gray in his stubble, the exhaustion in the lines around his eyes. He did not move. He just looked at her. He was asking. May felt her heart, which she thought had turned to stone, give a single, painful kick. She was terrified, not of him, of this, of the hope. Ellis lifted one hand, slowly. He did not touch her face or her hair. He placed it, palm flat, on her shoulder. A question. His eyes searched hers in the moonlight. "May I?" May's breath hitched. She could have stepped back. She could have turned her head. She did neither. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. One single, slow dip of her chin. "Yes." He leaned in, his other hand coming up to rest on her other shoulder. He was clumsy, hesitant. This was not the act of a practiced man, but of one relearning a lost language. He lowered his head, and his forehead rested against hers. They stood like that for a long moment, just breathing, their foreheads touching, their eyes closed. Then he tilted his head, and his lips, chapped and dry, found hers. It was not a kiss of passion. It was a kiss of profound, desperate, and shared loneliness. It was slow. It was awkward. It was as necessary as water. It tasted of dust, and coffee, and smoke, and something new, something that was just them. It was a promise that they were no longer just two people, but a we. He pulled back, but only an inch. His hands were still on her shoulders, holding her as if she might bolt. She kept her eyes closed, her forehead still resting against his. The wind, which had been rising again, suddenly died down, leaving the night in a profound, perfect silence. The scene closed. Finally, she stepped back. He let his hands fall. They stood in the moonlight. The air between them changed, charged, and new. "The horses are fine," she said. her voice barely a whisper. "Yes," he said. They walked back to the house. She went to the ladder that led to her loft in the barn. He went to the door of the stone house. They paused, each at their own threshold. "Good night, May," he said. He had never used her name before. "Good night, Ellis," she replied. The words, a simple, quiet farewell, hung in the cold night air like smoke. She climbed to her hayloft. He went into his house. They went to their separate beds, but both of them knew, as they lay in the dark, listening to the vast, empty silence of the ridge solitude, had a new name. The morning after the storm. The world was raw. The air was so clean it hurt to breathe, and the sunlight on the scoured land was sharp as broken glass. They met in the kitchen, not as employer and hand, not as stranger and vagrant, but as two people who had shared a kiss in the moonlight. The silence that had once been a barrier was now just a space, waiting to be filled. May made the coffee. Ellis set out 2 plates. He had shot a rabbit that morning, and the smell of it frying with wild onions filled the small room. They ate. When they were done, May did not clear the plates. She wiped her hands on her trousers, went to the corner where her satchel was, and brought it to the table. She unbuckled the stiff leather flap. Ellis watched, his hands flat on the wood. She took out the string-bound ledger. It was the book she had told him to burn, the book she had placed between them as a test. Now, she placed it on the table and, with steady fingers, untied the string. She opened it. The pages were filled with her fine, precise hand. But it was not just script. It was numbers, coordinates, elevations, and sketches. It was a perfect, secret mirror of the land, a catechism of theft. "I was a clerk at the Gila Pacific Survey Office in Benson," she said, her voice low. "I recorded the field notes." She turned a page. "This is the original survey for the Silver Thread Spring. This is the boundary line, marker M22. This is where the water belongs." She turned another page, this one showing a map that was almost identical, but crucially different. "And this is the map Byron Kells filed with the Territorial Office. The marker is adjusted. 2 miles north. He used this map to claim the spring. He dried up every rancher in that valley." Ellis said nothing, but his jaw tightened. "Kells is a builder," May continued, her finger tracing a line. "But he builds with stolen lines." She turned to a new section, one filled not with maps, but with names and numbers. "He doesn't work alone. This is the bribe ledger, a payment to the county surveyor, a land fee to a territorial judge. And this," she tapped a name, "Ward Pike. He's Kells's foreman. He's the man who moves the stones, who threatens the witnesses. And this," her finger landed on a bold, arrogant signature at the bottom of a disbursement order. "Byron Kells. He approved a $200 bonus to Pike for expedited surveying, the same day the Silver Thread map was filed." Finally, she turned to the last page she had filled. It was a new map, one she had been working on from memory and from the railroad rumors she'd heard in town. It showed Confluence Ridge. It showed Ellis's ranch. And it showed a new, sharp, dotted line cutting across it. "He's coming here. Ellis," she said. "The new spur line. They're calling it the Switchback 12. I heard the men at the post talking. They're going to break ground within a month." Her finger traced the dotted line, which curved in a way that made no sense from an engineering standpoint. It made a deep, illogical detour. "It's a bad line," Ellis said, his voice a gravelly rumble. "Any fool engineer would take it straight over the low pass." "Exactly." May tapped a spot on the map, just upstream from his house. "Unless the engineer was being paid to, accidentally, cut right through the aquifer that feeds your well. The well I found, the water that is the only reason this ridge is habitable." She looked up at him, her eyes holding his. "He'll do the same thing here. He'll file a map, claim the water for the railroad right-of-way. And in 6 months, this place will be dust. He won't even have to buy you out. He'll just break you." Ellis Rourke stared at the map. He stared at the dotted line that was a sentence of death for his home. He closed his eyes, and when he spoke, the silence was finally, truly, broken. It was the first time she had heard him speak more than 3 sentences at once. "My brother," he said, his voice flat, dredging up a history he had buried. He had a place on the San Pedro, a good place, water year-round. He had 300 head. He had a wife, 2 sons. He took a breath. Then the GKE mining company wanted the water. They filed a new claim. They had a map, all official, stamped and sealed, that showed his marker was a quarter-mile south of the river. A quarter-mile. Just 1 line of ink on a piece of paper. He fought it, Ellis continued, his gaze distant, seeing a different map, a different time. He went to the court in Tucson. He showed them his father's deed. They showed him their new map. The judge sided with the map. He lost the water, lost the cattle. He tried to dry farm for a year. The bank took the land. His wife, she took the boys and went back east to her folks. My brother, he put a rope over a rafter in the barn he didn't own anymore. Ellis stood up from the table. He walked to the window, his back to her. He didn't die for a lack of water. He died because of a line, because of ink. He turned back, his eyes no longer cold iron, but hot steel. Byron Kells. I've heard his name. He was on the board of that mining company. The room was silent. May's secret was now their secret. His past was now their present. "So we fight him," May said. It wasn't a question. "How?" Ellis said. "With what, this book?" He gestured to the ledger. "It's your word against his. You're a wanted woman. I'm a failed rancher. That map just makes us targets." "No," May said, her own resolve hardening. "It's not just the book. We take it to someone Kells can't buy and can't threaten. Federal Judge Lucretia Baird in Prescott." "Prescott," Ellis scoffed. "That's 100 miles, and the road goes straight through San Isidro. That's Kells's town. The sheriff is his, the telegraph operator is his. We'd be in cuffs before we even saw the courthouse." "I know," May said. "And you're right. The book isn't enough. A map is just ink. Baird will need more. She'll need living proof. Proof like who Ward Pike." "No." May's eyes were alive now. The mind of the surveyor, the woman of numbers, taking over. "Proof, physical proof, stone. We don't just tell her the map is wrong. We prove it." She went back to the ledger, to her first, hurried notes. "When the territory was first surveyed, in the 1850s, they put down stone markers, granite, most of them. They chiseled the coordinates, orphan stones. The old hands called them, because they were out there all alone. The new surveys, Kells's surveys, they don't dig them up. That's too much work. They just sink a new iron pin marker a mile away and file the new map, claiming the old one was lost or in error. So we find the old ones, the originals, the ones that prove Kell's entire grid is a lie." She pointed on her own hand-drawn map. "There are 3 of them in the Coyote Narrows, the ones that define the original Valley Water Grant. M37, M38, M39. I know the coordinates. I know where they're buried. If we can dig one up, if we can bring a 30-pound block of granite chiseled with the United States territorial seal into her courtroom, alongside this ledger, then it's not our word against Kells, it's the law against him." Ellis stared at her, a new, slow respect dawning in his eyes. This was not a runner. This was a fighter. This was a planner. "Dig them up," he said, testing the words. "Dig them up," she confirmed. "We'll need the wagon. We'll need shovels. And we'll need to be fast." "All right," he said. The word was a vow. "I'll get the wagon ready. We'll leave tonight." The plan was set. The pact was sealed. The hope lasted for 3 hours. It was broken by the arrival of a rider, a local boy from a neighboring ranch, bringing the mail he'd picked up at Pritchard's. He handed Ellis a letter and a small sack. "Appreciate it, Tom." Ellis said, "No trouble, Mr. Rourke. Nasty business. That storm, almost as nasty as the company at the post." May, who had been coiling a rope, froze. "Company?" Ellis asked, his voice casual. "Aye. 2 bounty men, long coats, mean-looking. Red Nolan and Sykes Bell. I heard Pritchard call them. They were asking questions." May felt the blood drain from her face. "Questions about what?" Ellis asked. His body still relaxed, but his eyes were on May. "Oh, some girl," the boy said, oblivious. "A runaway. They said, from up Benson Way, stole something from the railroad. They were real specific." "Specific how?" "Said she was traveling light, said she was smart, and said she was wearing a dark blue wool scarf." The boy tipped his hat. "Well, gotta get on. Good day." He rode off. May and Ellis stood in the yard. The bright, clean sun suddenly felt cold. The hunters were not just in town. They were on her trail. They had her description. May looked down. The indigo scarf, the first thing he had given her, was still tied around her neck. It was her brother's scarf, the last thing she had of him. But it was no longer a comfort. It was a noose. She said nothing. She walked to the fire pit in the center of the yard, where they burned trash. Ellis followed. With steady hands, May untied the scarf. The wool was coarse, familiar. She held it for a long second, her face hard. She was saying goodbye, to her past, to her brother, to the woman who ran. She dropped it into the pit. Ellis, seeing her intention, struck a match and tossed it in. The wool resisted at first, then it began to smolder. A foul, oily smoke rising. It caught. A small, bright blue flame licked at the edge. Ellis watched the fire, but his eyes were on May's face. He was watching her burn her last bridge. He was watching her choose to stay, to fight. He knew in that moment that this was no longer her fight. It was theirs. The line had been drawn. "You said," he said, his voice quiet, "that we go to Prescott, that we show the judge." "We do," May said, her eyes on the flames. "But them, Nolan and Bell, they're not lawyers. They won't wait for a courtroom." "I know. They find us. They'll be shooting." May turned from the fire, the last of the scarf turning to black ash. "We have the knife you gave me. We have your rifle. We have the element of surprise." "No," Ellis said. He put his hand on her arm, stopping her. "We have the law. That's what you said. We have the truth. We don't beat them by being faster on the draw. We don't beat them by spilling blood in the dirt. We beat them by bringing the truth, whole and clean, to the one place they can't buy it." He looked toward the canyon. "We go straight. No detours. We get the stones. We get to Prescott. And we let the law do the shooting." May looked at him, at this man of silence, who had just offered a vow of justice, not revenge. She nodded. "Straight. No detours." The war had begun, but it would be fought their way. The dawn was not a sunrise. It was an incision. A thin, cold line of gray light cut into the blackness of the high desert. They had been riding since 3 in the morning, leaving the ranch dark and silent. Ellis led on his horse, May on the steadier mule, her satchel and the ledger tied in front of her. Juniper, the cattle dog, ranged ahead, a silent gray shadow in the half-light. They were moving into the Coyote Narrows, a deep scar in the earth where the rock walls closed in, squeezing a dry, boulder-strewn riverbed. The air was cold, and the only sound was the click of hooves on stone. Ellis reined in. "This is it." He pointed not to a landmark, but to a feeling. May consulted her notes, the small page she had copied from her ledger, reading it in the first dim light. "The coordinates are for M38, 1857 survey. It should be near a pillar of basalt, close to the wash. The dog will find it." Ellis said. Juniper was already moving, her nose to the ground. She was not on a rabbit's trail. This was different. She was tracking the faint, strange scent of buried minerals, or perhaps the lingering salt of the men who had put the stone there decades ago. She led them past a cluster of ironwood, through a fissure in the rock choked with brittle sagebrush. The smell of the herb, crushed underfoot, was sharp and clean. The dog stopped. She looked back at Ellis and whined. A low, single note. "Here," May said, her voice dropping. She slid from the mule. It looked like nothing, just a shallow depression, a washout beside a towering pillar of black rock. "Start digging," Ellis said. He unlashed the shovels from the mule. The ground was hard, packed clay and scree. They dug for 10 minutes, the metallic scrape of the shovels echoing in the canyon's silence. May's shovel struck something. It made a flat, scraping sound. Not a rock. They dropped to their knees, clawing the hard dirt away with their hands. May's fingers, already raw, found a sharp, squared edge. It was granite, gray and flecked with mica. It was not natural. Ellis used his shovel as a lever, jamming it under the edge. With a great grunt, he heaved, and the stone rolled free from the earth that had held it for over 30 years. It was a foot square, thick and heavy, and chiseled into its face, deep and sure, were the marks U.S., and below it, M38. May let out a breath she felt she had been holding since she left Benson. It was real. It was the truth, in stone. She took out her ledger and a pencil, her hand shaking slightly. She began to write, noting the condition, the location, the depth. Ellis, meanwhile, was not idle. He worked with the practiced, precise motions of a man who understood the land. He unpacked his own tools, not just shovels, but a tripod and a small, brass transit level. "What are you doing?" May asked. "The stone is good," Ellis said, his eye to the site, "but the court will want to know where we found it." He was not just a rancher. He was a miner, a prospector by necessity. He took a sighting from the rising sun, measuring its angle against the canyon wall. He was creating a map for the map, a witness for the witness. "The sun doesn't lie," he said. "We'll prove its position." The sound came from above, the clatter of iron-shod hooves on rock. It was distant, but in the narrow canyon, it echoed, magnified, sounding like it was right on top of them. Ellis's head snapped up. Juniper was already at the mouth of the fissure, her ruff stiff, a low growl in her throat. May scrambled, trying to push the heavy marker back into the hole, kicking dirt over it. "Too late," Ellis said, grabbing her arm. "They're above." He pulled her behind the basalt pillar. He peered through the sage, far down the canyon. At the southern entrance they had used, 2 riders were silhouetted against the bright morning light. "Nolan and Belle," May breathed, her hand flying to the knife in her boot. Ellis looked north, up the canyon, the only other way out. A single rider sat there, blocking the pass. "They've boxed us in," Ellis said, his voice flat. "Pritchard must have sent word. What do we do?" Ellis looked up. On a high, narrow ledge, a small cluster of his own stray cattle, 5 or 6 heifers, were huddled. They had wandered into the canyon for shade. A sudden, cold idea sparked in his eyes. "The marker stays," he whispered. "We'll come back for it." He grabbed a rock and threw it hard. It struck the basalt pillar with a sharp crack, like a gunshot. The cattle startled, looking down. "Yeah." Ellis roared. A sound of sudden, shocking violence that ripped through the quiet. He fired his rifle into the air, the shot booming between the walls. The heifers panicked. They turned and charged down the only path available, a steep scree slope leading to the canyon floor. "Dust!" Ellis said, grabbing May's hand. "Run! Now!" The cattle hit the floor in a small, terrified stampede, their hooves kicking up a massive, choking plume of yellow dust. The entire canyon floor vanished. From above, a shout. "What in the hell is that?" Using the dust as a perfect, temporary screen. Ellis pulled May toward the canyon wall. "Up the goat track." They scrambled, bent double, while the air filled with curses and the sound of spooked horses. The path was narrow, inches wide in places, slick with loose gravel. May was breathing hard, her lungs burning, the satchel with the ledger banging against her hip. A shot rang out, blind, from the canyon floor. A bullet whined off the rock face, 10 feet above her head. "He's just shooting at the noise," Ellis yelled back, pulling her along. "Keep moving." They reached a chimney, a vertical split in the rock. "Up," Ellis ordered. He scrambled up, finding holds. May, burdened by the satchel, followed. She reached for a handhold, and the rock she grabbed, weakened by a recent rain, crumbled in her hand. She fell. She did not scream, just a sharp gasp as she slid. Clawing at the rock, she landed hard on the narrow ledge below, the satchel skidding, stopping inches from a 20-foot drop to the rocks. Ellis was 5 feet above her, on the next level. May! Another shot, this one closer. Chipping stone that rained down on her. She was stuck. The rock face was too sheer to climb without help. Ellis didn't hesitate. He uncoiled the lariat he always wore at his belt. He snapped his wrist, the loop falling perfectly around her shoulders and under her arms. "Grab it!" She fisted the rope. "I'm pulling," he yelled. He braced himself, his boots digging into the rock, the muscles in his back and arms straining. He hauled. May scrambled with her feet, fighting for purchase, the rope biting into her. He pulled her over the lip of the ledge. She collapsed against him, her chest heaving, her knuckles bleeding. They clung to each other for one single, instinctive second. It was not a kiss. It was an affirmation. 2 bodies, one purpose, clinging to the side of a mountain. His arm was a steel band around her. Her hands were fisted in his shirt, her face buried in his shoulder. A long, shared breath. Then he released her, pushing her forward. "Run!" And they ran. They reached the high plateau, breathless, just as Nolan and Belle met on the canyon floor below. Confused, their horses spooked and coughing in the dust. "They'll track us," Ellis said, his voice hard. "They'll see where we went. We have to be faster." They ran for a mile, across the broken high country, until they came to a place called Dead Girl Wash. It was a deep, narrow arroyo, dry as a bone, that cut a path toward the next canyon. It was the only way across. "Here," Ellis said, stopping. "We make a stand, or rather, a trip." He unslung his lariat. He tied one end to a thick, gnarled juniper root, half buried in the arroyo's side. "May, take this, the other side, behind that rock. Wrap it, and hold it till you hear them. When they're in the wash, pull it tight, then get down." She took the heavy rope, scrambled down the bank, across the dry sand, and up the other side. She hid behind the rock, her heart hammering. They didn't wait long, the sound of galloping horses. Nolan and Belle were pushing hard. "They're coming," May hissed. "Now, May tight." She hauled the rope, pulling the slack, and wrapped it twice around the rock. The rope was now a taut, invisible line, 6 inches off the ground, across the dark sand. Nolan was in the lead. He rode recklessly, charging his horse into the wash at a full gallop. The horse's forelegs hit the rope. The animal screamed, a terrible, high-pitched sound. As it somersaulted, its legs snapped from under it. Red Nolan was launched from the saddle. He flew 20 feet, landing in a sickening, boneless heap against the arroyo's far wall. Sykes Bell, right behind him, reared his horse back just in time, the animal screaming and dancing, eyes wide with terror. Nolan wasn't moving. Bell, in a cold rage, pulled his pistol. He couldn't see them. He started shooting wildly, firing into the shadows where he thought they were. A metallic ping. A bullet struck the copper pot tied to Ellis's pack, which he had dropped behind his own rock. It was ruined. A neat hole punched clean through it. Bell was reloading, cursing. Nolan was stirring, groaning, trying to push himself up with one arm. His other arm hung at a useless, terrible angle. His shoulder was clearly dislocated. "He has us pinned," May whispered. "No," Ellis said. He rose from his cover. He did not aim his rifle at Sykes Bell. He aimed it at what Bell was holding. He fired. The shot was singular. Perfect. It didn't hit Bell. It hit the wooden stock of Bell's rifle. The gun exploded in Bell's hands, a spray of splintered walnut and hot metal. Bell yelped, dropping the ruined weapon, clutching his stinging hands. Ellis stepped into the open, his own rifle leveled. "Get off the horse, Bell," Ellis said, his voice carrying in the sudden silence. Bell, his hands bleeding, his eyes wide with fear, slid from the saddle. "Now walk over to your friend." Bell stumbled over to Nolan. who was now sitting up, clutching his shattered shoulder, his face pale and slick with sweat. "We should tie them," May said, stepping out, the knife in her hand. "No," Ellis said, his rifle steady. "We leave them. It's a day's walk back to the post." "Maybe longer, for a man with a bad shoulder. You'll live." He looked directly at Bell. "The court needs them alive to talk. They're witnesses. They'll have to testify who hired them to hunt us." He lowered his rifle. "Go." Bell, terrified and defeated, hauled his groaning partner to his feet, cursing, stumbling, and supporting each other. The two bounty hunters began the long walk south. Ellis and May worked fast. They found the other two markers, M37 and M39. They were smaller, boundary stones, but they were chiseled. They were legal. They were truth. May wrapped the two stones in a spare blanket and secured them in Ellis's pack. Alongside her ledger, night found them exhausted. High on the ridge, they found shelter in a shallow salt cave, a place deer used to lick the mineral-rich rock. It was cold. They ate the last of their cornbread, dry. From the darkness below, the world away, the Gila Pacific train wailed. Its whistle was not a sound of progress. It was the shriek of a monster, the voice of Byron Kells, hunting them in the dark. "Tomorrow," May whispered, her voice muffled in the cave. "We have to cross the main road to Prescott. We have to get through San Isidro. That's his town." "We won't go through it," Ellis whispered back, his voice close in the dark. "We'll go around. I know an old mining track. It'll put us on the Prescott Road, north of his men." They planned in low, urgent whispers, their heads close, their breath misting. They were just settling, trying to find a way to rest, when Juniper, who had been lying at the cave's mouth, went stiff, a low, almost inaudible growl. Ellis put his hand on her, silencing her. He crept to the mouth of the cave and looked down. May followed, far below, on the Prescott Road. The road they had to take. A new star had been born. And another, and another. Torches. It was a picket line. A dozen men on horseback, blocking the artery north. It wasn't just Nolan and Bell anymore. Kells had sent a posse. They were cut off. They retreated from the dark mouth of the salt cave, but the damage was done. The sight of the torches below a long, malevolent picket line of fire had stolen the air from the small space. The road to Prescott was no longer a road. It was a barricade. Kells had sealed the county. The moonlight, which had been their guide, now seemed a traitor. It poured over the high ridge, painting the basalt rocks in silver and bone white. It made their hiding place stark in their figures. Should they move? A perfect target. Ellis was checking the loads in his rifle, his movements economical, silent. May was repacking the two heavy, blanket-wrapped stones in the pack, making sure they were balanced. Her hands were steady. She had done her part. She had found the truth. Now, they just had to carry it home. She finished, buckling the last strap, and a sudden, violent tremor ran through her. It was not the cold. The wind was sharp, but the cave was sheltered. This was a shiver that started in her spine and shook her, head to foot, a single, convulsive rattle. Ellis's hand stopped moving. He didn't look up, but he had seen it. May clenched her jaw, furious at the weakness. It was not fear of the men, or the guns, or the long fall from the ridge. It was the sudden, crushing understanding of the stakes. This was the end of the line. If they were caught here, if they failed to break through that line of torches, it was over. Not just their lives. The ledger would be burned. The stones would be tossed back into the canyon. Kells would win. The silver thread, Confluence Ridge, and her brother, Toby. All of it would be erased by the man with the forged maps. This was not a fight. It was the last, desperate stand, and the realization of its finality had, for 1 second, frozen her. If we fail, this is the last time. She felt a shadow fall over her. Ellis was standing in front of her. He had seen the shiver, understood its source, and offered no useless words. He did not say, "It will be all right." He simply shrugged off his own heavy canvas coat, the one that had seen him through a decade of droughts and blizzards. It smelled of him, of wood smoke, horse, and the sharp, metallic scent of the dust storm. He draped it over her shoulders. It was a physical weight, heavy and encompassing, and it stopped the shaking immediately. It was an anchor. She looked up to thank him, but the words died. His hands had not retreated after settling the coat. One hand remained, resting on the back of her neck, just below her hairline. His fingers were rough, calloused, but his touch was incredibly light. It was not a grasp. It was not a gesture of ownership. It was the same silent question he had asked in the barn, his forehead against hers. "Are you here? Are you with me?" She didn't nod. She didn't have to. She leaned into the touch, a fraction of an inch, and it was all the answer he needed. The walls of the cave, the torchlight, the entire vast and hostile territory of Arizona. It all vanished. There was only the space of 2 feet between them, lit by the silver moon pouring in. He did not pull her. She moved. She rose from her crouch, her hands finding his waist, gripping the rough denim of his trousers. He met her, his other arm coming around her back, pulling her flush against him. This was not the tentative, lonely kiss from the barn. This was its opposite. This was a collision. This was a culmination of the run through the canyon, the terror of the fall, the victory at the wash, and the desperation of the torchlight below. His hand moved from her neck into her hair, tangling in the dusty, loose strands, and he tilted her head back. His mouth found hers. It was a long, deep kiss, and it was breathless. It was rough. It tasted of the salt from the cave walls, of the metallic tang of adrenaline, of the grit and dust of their long day. It was a kiss that was not about romance, but about affirmation. A desperate, gasping claim to life in the face of the men who waited below. They were breathing each other's air, their chests heaving, their hearts hammering a rhythm that drowned out the sound of the night wind. It was a brand, a seal, a promise made without words. He broke the kiss, but they did not separate. They remained locked in the embrace, foreheads pressed together, gasping. The space between them was electric, hot. "Stay," he whispered, the word a rough sound against her skin. It meant everything. "Stay here, stay safe, stay alive. Go together," she whispered back, her voice fierce, her hands fisted in his shirt. It was not a plea. It was a correction. It was a statement of fact. There is no here without you. We go together. Always. From the cave mouth, the moonlight cast their shadows onto the smooth, salt-streaked wall. There was no longer May Caldwell and Ellis Rourke. There was only one silhouette, a single, unmoving shape against the silvered stone, a testament in shadow. The only sound in the world was the deep, shared pounding of 2 hearts, a drumbeat for the battle to come. Slowly, they pulled apart. The separation was a physical thing, like pulling wool, but it was necessary. The moment was over. The resolve had set. Ellis adjusted the coat, his coat on her shoulders. May, her hands surprisingly steady, retied the strap of her hat. They looked at each other. The fear was gone. The desperation was gone. The vulnerability was gone. What remained was something harder, something forged. It was the absolute, unspoken, and unbreakable knowledge of us. They were no longer 2 separate people fighting their own battles. They were a single unit. Ellis turned and picked up his own dagger from his belt. It was the horn-handled one, the one he had given her in the kitchen, the one she had returned when he'd given her the smaller boot knife. It was his knife. He stepped in front of her. He did not ask. He simply pushed her new coat aside and found the thick leather of her belt. With quick, sure movements, he lashed his own empty sheath to it. Then, he took the heavy, balanced blade and slid it home. "If one falls," he said, his voice low and absolute, "the other reaches the court. This," he tapped the horn handle, "this gets to Prescott, even if we don't." May looked at the knife, his knife on her hip. It was the heaviest thing she had ever carried. He was entrusting her not with his life, but with his legacy, with his brother's memory, with the mission. "It will get there," she said. She held out her hand. Not in supplication, not in affection. He took it. Their grasp was hard, knuckles tight, a soldier's grip. It was the pact, sealed. This was not a war of revenge. They would not become Kells. They would not spill blood for pleasure. They would fight, and they would defend. But the ultimate victory was not on the ridge. It was in the courtroom. "Law, not blood," she said, repeating their vow. "Straight, no detours," he answered. They released their grip. The time for words, for touch, for fear was over. From the mouth of the cave, where she had been standing guard, Juniper gave a single, soft bark. Ellis picked up his rifle. May shouldered the heavy pack with the stones. It was time to go. They did not sleep. They used the darkness to move, skirting the picket line, taking a high, treacherous game trail that Ellis knew from his youth. It was a path no wagon could take, but it let them bypass the main road. They walked for hours, leading the horse and mule. By the time the sky grayed, they were 10 miles north of the blockade, hidden in a deep arroyo. "This is as far as we go on foot," Ellis said. He had a plan, one that was simple and desperate. He left May with Juniper, the pack, and the stones. "Stay hidden. I'll be back by sundown. If I am not, you take the ledger and you walk to Prescott. You hear me, May?" She just nodded, her face grim, clutching his coat. He returned just as the sun was touching the horizon, leading a single, sway-backed horse that pulled a rickety buckboard wagon. On the side, faded and peeling, were the words, "You as mail?" "Stole it?" May asked. "Traded," Ellis said flatly. "The horse and mule for this, and a $10 gold piece. The station master at Rock Point thinks he got the better end of the deal. He's probably right." He had also acquired 2 items of clothing. The first was a long, black, slightly moth-eaten coat, the kind a traveling preacher or an undertaker might wear. The second was a woman's black mourning hat, heavy with a thick, dark veil. "I can't," May said, her voice small. "You can," Ellis replied, holding it out. "They're looking for a woman in trousers with a blue scarf. They are not looking for a grieving widow. They are not looking for a mail courier. We are ghosts. May, we just have to look the part." They loaded the wagon. The 2 heavy, blanket-wrapped stones were placed at the bottom, covered with empty mail sacks. May put on the coat, her small frame lost in it, and the hat, dropping the veil over her face. She became an anonymous, tragic shape. Ellis put on a battered hat and a canvas duster. He was no longer a rancher. He was a civil servant, paid too little, driving a route he hated. Juniper was told to lie in the wagon bed, under a pile of sacks, with a stern command to be silent. They rode through the night. And at dawn, they approached the outskirts of San Isidro. This was Kells's town. The railroad had built it, and he owned it. From the sheriff's office to the saloon. A checkpoint, made of a single railroad tie and 2 armed men in dusty coats, blocked the road. Ellis didn't slow. He just plodded the horse forward, looking bored and tired. "Whoa up, driver," one of the guards, a man with a stained tobacco beard, called out, leveling a rifle. Ellis pulled the reins. "You as mail," he said, his voice a dull monotone. "On a schedule. Mail, hey, open the back. We're looking for cargo." The other guard, younger, his rifle held awkwardly, smirked. "I've got nothing but empty sacks and my wife," Ellis said, gesturing with his thumb. "And she's in no mood for company. We're taking her sister's body to Prescott for burial." May, behind the veil, let out a low, convincing, mournful sob. The first guard's eyes softened for a second. "Apologies, ma'am." He turned back to Ellis. "Still, orders are orders. Got to check." He moved to the back of the wagon. "Just lift the flap. Let's see these empty sacks." Ellis's hand was near his rifle, but his face was a mask of weary obedience. The guard lifted the flap. He saw the pile of sacks. He jabbed one, hard, with the barrel of his rifle. There was a muffled yelp. The guard froze. "What in the hell was that?" My dog," Ellis said, thinking fast. "A dog." The guard's suspicion returned, threefold. "They said the runaways might have a dog. Get it out. Get everything out." May's heart stopped. She saw Ellis's hand tighten. Then, a flash of inspiration, born of pure desperation, hit May from under the veil. She reached into the wagon bed and, finding Juniper's flank, she gave a sharp, vicious pinch. Juniper, betrayed and in pain, let out a much louder yelp, a sound of genuine distress. "It's sick," May cried, her voice high and panicked from behind the veil. "Oh, Lord, it's the sickness from the canyon. He's sick." She pinched the dog again. Harder. Juniper could not be blamed for what happened next. She was confused, in pain, and had been jolted in a wagon for 2 days. She heaved. The guard, who was just leaning in, rifle first, was met with a sudden, warm, and copious spray of half-digested rabbit and bile. It hit his chest, his arms, and, most spectacularly, his brand-new leather boots. The man shrieked, staggering back, dropping his rifle. He looked down at his ruined boots with a look of pure, unadulterated horror. "Ah, it's on me. It's all over me. I told you he was sick," May wailed. The other guard was laughing so hard he had to lean on the barrier. "You look pretty. Hank—" "Shut up, get them out of here," Hank sputtered, gagging, frantically wiping his boot on the grass. "Get this cursed wagon out of my sight. Go!" Ellis did not need to be told twice. He snapped the reins, and the horse, sensing the urgency, broke into a ragged trot. They passed through the checkpoint, leaving the guard cursing and vomiting in the road. They arrived in Prescott at noon. It was a real town, built of brick and ambition. The federal courthouse was a 2-story granite building with tall windows and a set of wide, imposing steps. It smelled of law. They left the wagon in an alley. Ellis carried the heavy pack. May carried the ledger, her veil now pinned up. They were no longer in disguise. They were plaintiffs. They walked into the main hall. A clerk, a thin man with a green visor and ink-stained fingers, looked up, annoyed. "Can I help you?" he snapped. "We need to see Judge Lucretia Baird," May said, her voice steady. The clerk sniffed. "Do you have an appointment? The judge's docket is full for the next 2 months. He started to look back down at his paperwork. "Come back in January." "This is not a civil matter that can wait," May said, her voice rising. "This is an emergency petition. An emergency. You say everyone's matter is an emergency. Miss Now, if you'll excuse me." "This is a federal matter," May said, her voice now ringing in the quiet hall, drawing the attention of 2 bailiffs. She slammed her hand, and the petition she had written last night, on his desk. "This is a petition for an emergency injunction to prevent the destruction of federal survey markers, as protected under Article 27 of the 1863 Territorial Survey Act. And we have evidence of a conspiracy to defraud the United States government." The clerk froze. The bailiff stepped closer. "Who?" a new voice said. "Just cited the Territorial Survey Act." The voice was deep, resonant, and held no trace of humor. A woman stepped from a chamber door. She was in her 50s, her hair a severe gray bun, her dress simple black bombazine. This was Judge Lucretia Baird. Her eyes were the most intelligent and intimidating May had ever seen. "I did, Your Honor," May said, stepping forward. "May Caldwell, and this is Ellis Rourke. I am busy, Miss Caldwell." "What is this about Article 27? "It's about this, Your Honor." May pushed the ledger across the desk. A record of bribery, fraud, and illegal land seizures by Commissioner Byron Kells of the Gila Pacific Railroad. "And it's about this," Ellis said, stepping forward. He unslung the pack from his shoulders and, with a heavy, groaning thud, dropped it on the floor. He unrolled the blanket. The 2 chiseled stones, M37 and M39, sat on the floor, hard, gray, and undeniable. Judge Baird looked at the ledger. She looked at the stones. She looked at May's ink-stained fingers and Ellis's raw, rope-burned hands. She saw the truth. "Mr. Hicks," she said to the clerk, "clear my afternoon. Bailiff, find me a federal marshal. We are opening a special tribunal in the matter of the integrity of the Confluence Ridge survey. Now." She struck a small bell on her desk, and the sound was as final as a gavel. The news traveled through Prescott with the speed of a telegraph wire. Within the hour, the small courtroom was full. Byron Kells arrived, flanked by a slick, Eastern-suited lawyer and a nervous, sweating Ward Pike. Kells was not alarmed. He was annoyed. He strode in as if he owned the building. "Your Honor," he said, his voice booming, "this is a farce. This woman," he pointed a contemptuous finger at May, "is a common thief. She is a fugitive, wanted for stealing $300 from my office in Benson. That is a territorial charge, Mr. Kells," Baird said, her voice cutting through his. "We are in a federal court, and we are here to discuss federal land. Miss Caldwell, you will be sworn in." May took the oath, and then she began. She was no longer a runaway. She was no longer a victim. She was a woman of numbers, and this was her domain. She did not yell. She did not accuse. She simply read, "On May 10th, a disbursement of $50 to Ward Pike for survey adjustments." Or, "On May 12th, the official map for the Silver Thread Spring was filed, moving the boundary 2 miles. On June 1st, a political donation of $100 to the county assessor who approved the map. It's all here, in his hand." "A forged ledger," Kells's lawyer shouted. "Is it?" May said, turning a page. "Then perhaps you can explain why the geological notes in this forged ledger perfectly match the actual physical land, while Mr. Kell's official map does not. She's a clerk. What would she know?" Kells was smiling, but it was a wolf smile. "I'll show you," Ellis Rourke said, his voice quiet, drawing all eyes. He had been busy. He had set up his miner's transit in the center of the room. He had taken string and, using the chiseled stones as anchors, had run 3 lines of taut twine across the floor. He pointed. This is the line from the M38 marker. This is the legal line, set by the sun. It puts the Confluence Ridge Spring on my property." And he then took another piece of string, a red one, and ran a new line. "This is Mr. Kells's line, the one on his new map. It is 200 yards south. It is a lie." The visual was devastating. A simple, 3-dimensional model of the theft, right on the courtroom floor. Byron Kells stopped smiling. Judge Baird turned her gaze, which was as sharp as a razor, onto the third man, Mr. Ward Pike. Pike, who had been trying to blend into the woodwork, flinched. "You are the Gila Pacific's field surveyor, are you not?" I'm a foreman, ma'am, Your Honor." Pike was sweating through his shirt. He kept glancing at Kells. "You are a surveyor by trade. Mr. Pike, I have seen your name on a dozen filings. Now, I am putting you under oath." A bailiff moved, and Pike, looking like a man walking to his own hanging, took the stand. "Mr. Pike," Baird said, leaning forward, "you've seen Mr. Rourke's model. You've heard Miss Caldwell's testimony. You are a man who knows the land. You will tell this court which line is true." Pike swallowed. He looked at Kells. He looked at the judge. He looked at the hard, silent face of Ellis Rourke. Outside the courthouse, a different kind of pressure was building. Red Nolan, his arm in a crude sling, his face a mask of purple bruises, and Sykes Bell, his hands bandaged, were loitering on the steps. They were Kells's last line of defense, but they were not alone. The local Prescott sheriff, a man who had no love for the railroad or its arrogant, hired guns, was standing 10 feet away, polishing an apple on his sleeve. He was watching them, and his deputy was watching them from across the street. The balance of power, the invisible map of Kells's influence, had finally found its border. It ended here, on the courthouse steps. Inside, the courtroom was dead silent. Ward Pike opened his mouth. He looked at Kells one last time, for a sign, for a rescue. Kells just stared back, his eyes full of cold, reptilian fury. And Ward Pike knew, in that moment, that he was alone. He turned to the judge. Ward Pike stood in the silence, the sweat on his forehead glistening in the dry heat of the courtroom. He was a trapped man, caught between the cold, reptilian fury of Byron Kells and the unyielding, ironclad will of Judge Lucretia Baird. He looked at Kells, one last desperate plea. Kells's face was stone. He had been cut loose. Pike knew, in that moment, that he was about to be sacrificed. "Mr. Pike," Judge Baird said, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room, "I will ask you one more time. Which line is true?" Before Pike could answer, the door at the back of the courtroom opened. A federal marshal stepped in, holding the door for a small, severe-looking woman in a gray dress. She was twisting a pair of gloves in her hands, her face pale but set. "Who is this?" Kells' lawyer demanded, rising to his feet. "That," Judge Baird said, a flicker of cold satisfaction in her eyes, "is a witness I subpoenaed this morning, as soon as I saw the name Pritchard's Trading Post in Miss Caldwell's notes. This is Mrs. Abigail Pritchard. She will be sworn in." Mr. Pritchard, the Trading Post owner, had been in the audience, and he looked at his wife in pure, slack-jawed astonishment. She had never defied him in her life. Abigail Pritchard took the stand, her voice small but clear. "Mrs. Pritchard," Baird said, "you and your husband run the Trading Post in Coyote Canyon, do you not?" "We do, Your Honor, for 20 years. Are you familiar with Mr. Byron Kells?" "I've seen him. He comes through. He's important." "And are you familiar with Mr. Ward Pike?" Abigail looked at Pike, who seemed to shrink. "Yes, ma'am. He's Mr. Kells's man. He's the one who leaves messages. Messages or payments." Kells's lawyer was on his feet. "Objection, the judge is leading the witness." "I will rephrase," Baird said, her eyes not leaving Abigail. "Mrs. Pritchard, on or around the 1st of last month, did you observe any transactions between Mr. Kells and any other party?" Abigail took a deep breath. "It was Mr. Kells. He was at the post. He was angry about a shipment. Mr. Pike was there. They were arguing, quiet-like. Mr. Pike gave Mr. Kells an envelope, a thick one, from the Gila Pacific Rail office." May stiffened. The envelope, the one she had seen Pritchard hide. "And did you see what was in this envelope?" "No, ma'am, but I saw what was on it. Mr. Kells, he dropped it, and when he bent to get it, something fell out. A receipt. He shoved it back in. But I saw it." "Saw what, Mrs. Pritchard?" "A receipt from the Benson Land Office for a filing fee. And it had a stamp on it, a red one. It said, 'Paid in full by Ward Pike.'" The courtroom was silent. "And," Abigail continued, gaining strength, "when my husband came back, he found another envelope. The one Mr. Kells had been waiting for. It was from the county assessor. My husband, he hid it, but I move his things. I saw the seal on it." "She's lying," Kells' lawyer shouted. "Am I?" Abigail said, her voice suddenly sharp. It was the assessor's seal, right next to the Gila Pacific stamp. They were pressed so close, the wax ran together. Like they were partners. The evidence was not a hammer blow. It was 1,000 tiny, precise cuts, and Ward Pike was bleeding. Judge Baird turned her gaze back to the sweating foreman. "Mr. Pike, you are still under oath. Your employer's associate has just placed you and a receipt in the same envelope. The court is now very interested in your version of events." Ward Pike looked at Kells. He saw no help. He saw a man who would let him hang. Pike broke. It was not a flood. It was a crumbling. "He made me," Pike whispered, his voice cracking. He said it was just adjusting, just rationalizing the lines." He made you do what? Baird pressed. Move the markers, Pike was shouting now, his face slick with tears of fear and rage. He made me move the damn markers. He said the old ones were wrong, that the land was dry anyway. He said the railroad was progress, and progress needed water. And the money. It was a bonus for hardship. It was hard work. Those stones are heavy. And the ledger, Baird pointed to May's book. Are those your payments? Yes, he paid me for silver thread. And he was going to pay me for confluence, he said. He said Rourke was a nobody. That he was just a squatter holding up the tide. Did you receive these payments directly from Mr. Kells? Yes, no, from the office, but he signed the chits. He always signed the chits. I kept one. You what? Kells' voice was a low, dangerous rumble. Pike, in his terror, had gone too far to go back. He reached into his own boot, his hands shaking violently. He pulled out a folded, sweat-stained piece of paper. I kept the last one, for the confluence survey, just in case, just for my own records. He threw it on the floor. It's got his seal, his private seal, not just the railroad. He signed it. Byron Kells was a man of immense, iron control. He had built an empire by never, ever showing his hand. But seeing his own private seal on a payment receipt for a federal crime, thrown on a courtroom floor by a sniveling, terrified subordinate, was too much. He lunged. It was not a rational move. He lunged past his lawyer, his face a mask of purple rage. He was not going for Pike. He was going for May. You, he roared, his arm outstretched, his finger pointing at her. You worthless, thieving little. I will see you buried in the desert. I will see you. He was cut off, not by the bailiffs, who were slow to react, but by Ellis. Ellis, who had been standing silent by his model, moved with the speed of a striking snake. He did not hit Kells. He simply stepped in front of May, a solid, unmoving wall of stone. Kells, in his blind rage, slammed into Ellis's chest as if he had run into a mountain. He staggered back, his face a picture of stunned disbelief. The courtroom exploded. Silence! Judge Baird's gavel cracked like a rifle shot. Silence in this court. The bailiffs, finally awake, grabbed Kells, hauling him back, his suit torn, his dignity gone. Judge Baird looked down, her face colder than a winter midnight. Mr. Kells, she said, her voice dripping ice. You have just, in a federal courtroom, in front of a dozen witnesses, threatened the life of a federal witness. Bailiff, that man is in your custody. This is an outrage, Kells' lawyer screamed. No, sir, Baird replied. This is a reckoning. She turned to the doors. Marshal, have the sheriff of Prescott join you. I believe you will find two men, a Mr. Nolan and a Mr. Bell, loitering on my steps. They are to be arrested on charges of assault with a deadly weapon, conspiracy, and obstruction of federal justice. The marshal, a tall, grim man, nodded and left. 2 minutes later, there were shouts from the street, a brief scuffle, and then the sound of men being dragged, cursing. Up the stairs, Nolan, his arm in its sling, and Bell, his hands bandaged, were hauled into the courtroom, looking stunned. Well, Baird said, looking at them, you two have been busy, and you look terrible. We ain't done nothing, Bell spat. You rode Mr. Rourke down. Baird said, you fired on Miss Caldwell. You were hired, off book, by Mr. Kells to hunt a witness, and the Prescott sheriff has your horses and the bullet holes in Mr. Rourke's property. Are you going to testify, or are you going to rot? Nolan, seeing Kells in the grip of the bailiffs, saw the game was over. He hired us. Nolan grunted, nodding at Kells, said she was a thief, paid a $500 bounty. Said he wanted her back, dead or alive. Didn't matter to him. The courtroom gasped. Kells had not just lost, he had been annihilated. Judge Baird took a breath. She looked at May. She looked at Ellis. She looked at the stones on her floor. This court, she said, her voice ringing with the full authority of the United States, finds the following. First, the map filed by the Gila Pacific Railroad for the Confluence Ridge right-of-way is declared null and void, as it is based on fraudulent surveys, bribery, and willful deception. Second, the water rights of Confluence Ridge, as defined by the original 1857 markers, M37, M38, and M39, are hereby affirmed and restored, in full, to their legal owner, Mr. Ellis Rourke. Ellis's shoulders, which had been tense for a decade, relaxed. He closed his eyes. Third, the charges of theft, filed in the Benson Township against Miss May Caldwell, are clearly an act of legal and corporate intimidation. This court finds her. Baird paused. Wholly innocent, and orders those charges expunged. May let out a breath she had been holding for months. She gripped the back of the chair in front of her, her knees weak. Fourth, this court issues a federal warrant for the arrest of Mr. Byron Kells on charges of conspiracy to commit federal fraud, witness intimidation, and bribery. He will be held without bail. And finally, Baird said, her gaze softening as she looked at May, in light of the testimony regarding a missing minor, this court will issue a federal tracing request through the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Territorial Marshals for a Mr. Toby Caldwell, last seen in the custody of the Gila Pacific Railroad. It was not a promise of his return, but it was a light. It was the first, smallest pinprick of light in a long, terrible darkness. A cheer went up from the back of the courtroom. The small ranchers and farmers who had come to watch the giant fall were on their feet. Kells, his face ashen, was dragged out by the bailiffs, along with a whimpering pike and the cursing, defeated bounty hunters. The room began to clear. Ellis Rourke walked to the bench, the two chiseled stones in his arms. He set them down. Gently, he looked up at Judge Baird. He, a man of so few words, could not find any. He just nodded, once. Then, he held out his calloused, rope-burned hand. Judge Baird, the most powerful jurist in the territory, reached down and shook it, a firm, strong grip. Thank you, Ellis Rourke said, his voice thick. Thank you for listening. It's my job to listen. Mr. Rourke, Baird said, a rare, thin smile touching her lips. You and Miss Caldwell, you just made it very easy. You brought the truth. It's a heavy thing to carry. Yes, ma'am, Ellis said. It is. May had walked out ahead of him. She stood on the top step of the courthouse, in the full, blinding, white-hot Arizona sun. She raised her hand to shield her eyes. She was free. The dark, mourning dress was still on her, but it felt wrong, a costume from a different life. The indigo scarf, her brother's scarf, the one that had been her last link to her old life, was gone, burned to ash in Ellis's fire pit. But as she stood there, the wind hitting her face, she didn't feel the loss. The past was gone, the past was ash, but the future, for the first time, felt as real and as solid as the granite steps beneath her feet. A new life, she thought, like a spring leaf after a long winter. A shadow fell across her. Byron Kells was being led, in cuffs, down the steps toward a marshal's wagon. He stopped, his face level with hers. His eyes were not dead, they were burning. He looked at her, and then at Ellis, who had just stepped out to stand beside her. You, Kells hissed, his voice a venomous whisper. You think you've won. You think you've saved that little patch of dirt. You're fools. He nodded at the parched, dusty street. The water will always dry up. This land is built on thirst. It will all dry up. And you will have nothing. He smiled, a broken, terrible smile. May did not flinch. She did not look at Ellis. She looked straight into Kells' burning eyes. Maybe, she said, her voice clear and carrying in the sudden quiet. The water might, but the law won't. Kells' smile vanished. The marshal yanked his arm, and he was gone. A prisoner of the truth he had tried to bury in stone. May stood in the sun, beside Ellis, and for the first time, she did not look back. The drought did not break. It was shattered. The rains came 3 weeks after the trial, not as a gentle relief, but as a biblical deluge. The sky turned a dark, bruised gray for 5 straight days, and the water came down in solid, silver sheets. The dry arroyos of Confluence Ridge, silent for a decade, roared to life. The sound was a symphony, a deep-throated, thundering chorus that drowned out every other noise in the world. On the 6th day, the sun came out. The land was not brown, it was green. A fine, impossible mist of new grass had sprung up overnight, and the new well, was overflowing, a steady, gurgling pulse of life. But the real water was the sound from the ditch. May stood on the porch of the stone house, not with a hammer, but with her pencil and a new, clean sheet of paper. She was drawing. She was mapping their own land, their own water. She was designing a system of irrigation, using her knowledge of elevation and grade, laying out a path for the water that was both scientific and beautiful. Ellis, stripped to the waist, his back and shoulders slick with mud, was the labor. He did not just dig, he built. He followed her lines, her small, staked flags. He used river stones to line the channel, to gentle the flow, to guide it away from the house and toward the parched pasture and the small patch of land they had set aside for a garden. He worked with a quiet, focused joy she had never seen in him. He was not just building a ditch. He was restoring his own life. And Juniper, who had never seen mud, was in a state of pure, ecstatic delirium. She raced from Ellis to May, her gray coat black with silt, barking at the running water, biting it, rolling in the new, glorious mess of it all. The work took weeks. As they worked, they also rebuilt. The barn, which had listed, was now straight, its timbers reinforced, its roof new. The stone house, scoured by the storm, was now whole. Ellis had reset the windows, and May had planted a small pot of desert marigolds by the door. One afternoon, Ellis rode back from the newly repaired corral, carrying a long, fresh-planed piece of pine. He had been working on it, in secret, in the evenings. He nailed it above the door, over the lintel. May stepped back, wiping her hands on her trousers, and read the letters he had carefully carved and burned into the wood. It did not say Rourke. It said Caldwell Rourke. Ranch and Survey. She looked at the sign. She looked at him. He was standing by the door, trying to look casual, his hands in his pockets, but a small, nervous smile played on his lips. "It's a business," he said gruffly. "People will need honest maps. Now that the competition is gone." May didn't say anything. She just walked up to him, stood on her toes, and kissed him. A short, firm kiss that tasted of sunlight and fresh paint. "I like it," she said. "But ranch should come first. The land is the foundation." "We can argue about the billing later," he said, and the smile, no longer nervous, broke free. The mail came a month later, not from a boy, but from a proper mail rider. His saddlebag stamped with the UNOS, Federal Eagle. He brought a letter. It was not for Ellis. It was for May Caldwell, care of Judge L. Baird, Prescott. The court had forwarded it. May sat at the kitchen table, the one where she had first shown him the ledger. Her hands, she noted, were no longer ink-stained. They were calloused, brown from the sun, and strong. She broke the seal. It was not a long letter. It was from a federal marshal in the New Mexico territory. He was responding to Judge Baird's inquiry. "No one by that name at the industrial school you mentioned. That place was shut down 2 years ago for labor violations. But the local Apache trackers, who work with our office, have a memory for names of boy, maybe 15 or 16, matching that description, Toby. He was seen last winter working a silver claim, not as a laborer, but for himself, up in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. He was heading towards Santa Fe." She read the letter 3 times. He was not in a school. He was not a prisoner. He was working. He was alive. He was in New Mexico. She did not realize she was crying, silent tears that dripped onto the paper, until a large, warm hand covered hers. Ellis was standing beside her. He had been watching her face. He did not ask what the letter said. He just took her hand, the one that held the letter, and squeezed it. She squeezed back. A grip of iron. It was not an end, but it was a beginning. It was a new map, a new direction. The next chapter, that evening. They rode to the trading post, Pritchard's. It was the first time they had been back to the place where it all began. Mr. Pritchard, a changed man since his wife had become a local hero, gave them their supplies at a 10% discount. On the house, he'd muttered, embarrassed. They did not go home right away. The sun was setting, turning the sky into a riot of orange and deep, high desert purple. They sat on the front steps, the same rickety steps where May had once slept. May ate from a tin of peaches. Ellis drank a bottle of sarsaparilla. It was quiet, peaceful. Ellis took a bite of a cracker. Then he leaned over, placing a piece of hardtack and cheese on the wooden step, down by her boot. May looked at the offering, then at him. He smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "For the girl sleeping on the porch," he said, his voice low. May didn't smile. She felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the sun. She just picked up the cheese and ate it, their shoulders companionably touching. The rain had come and gone again, leaving the night air cool and clean, smelling of sage and wet dust. They were on their own porch, the porch of Caldwell Rourke. The marigolds she had planted were bright yellow in the moonlight. They sat side by side in 2 chairs Ellis had built, not touching, just existing in the same peaceful space, after a while. May stood and walked to the railing, looking out at the dark, silvered line of the pasture, the sound of the water, their water, gurgling in the new ditch, was the only sound. Ellis came and stood beside her. She leaned her head, resting it on his shoulder. It was a comfortable, easy gesture. He did not put his arm around her. He just covered her hand, the one on the railing, with their fingers interlaced. A perfect, calloused fit. They stood like that for a long time, breathing in the night, breathing in the peace. She turned her head, her cheek against the rough flannel of his shirt, and looked up at him. He looked down. His eyes, in the moonlight, were no longer cold iron. They were warm, and they were full of her. He lowered his head, and his forehead rested against hers. The same gentle gesture, the same silent question. She raised her free hand, not to his face, but to his chest, right over his heart, and just held it there. Yes, his lips met hers. It was not the desperate, hungry kiss of the cave, nor the lonely, tentative kiss of the barn. This was a kiss of arrival. It was light, and it was long, and it was sure. It was a promise of 1,000 more nights just like this. It was the soft, slow, and certain kiss of home. He pulled back, his forehead still against hers, their breath mingling. From the new garden, a frog, the first frog on Confluence Ridge, began to call. Ellis put his arm around her waist, and together, they turned. The light from the oil lamp in the kitchen cast a warm, yellow square onto the porch. They walked into it, toward the door. He closed it behind them, shutting out the wild dark, and welcoming in the shared light. A moment later, the lamp went out, and the only thing to be seen was the reflection of the moonlight, wet and bright, on the newly filled irrigation ditch. Later that night, by a single candle, May sat at the kitchen table. She opened a new, clean ledger. On the first page, in her fine, precise hand, she wrote August 22nd, the day the water returned, and so did the law. In the corner, Ellis sat, cleaning his rifle. On the table next to him was the old ledger, the one that had cost her so much, and given them everything. It was full of her own neat script, and the blood, sweat, and lies of Byron Kells. Its mission was complete. Ellis picked it up. He did not open it. He ran his hand over the worn cover. Then, he walked to the heavy wooden chest where his father had kept his deeds, and he placed the book inside. He closed the lid. It was a final, respectful burial. The past was not forgotten. It was simply filed. He came back to the table, sat down, and pulled a fresh piece of paper toward him. He picked up his own pencil. He was not a map maker, not like May, but he began, with a slow, careful hand, to sketch a plan for a new, stronger corral. Life would go on, built on good fences, honest water, and true maps. At Pritchard's trading post, there was a new sign, nailed to the post by the front steps. It was small, painted by Abigail herself. It read, "No one sleeps on the steps." Inside, Mr. Pritchard, under the watchful, proud eye of his wife, had a new rule. He kept a small, separate ledger, hidden under the counter. May had left $10 with him, a staggering sum. "It's an account," she had told him, "for anyone who comes through, hungry, the ones who look like they're at the end of their rope. You feed them, no questions asked, and you tell them the law is in Prescott, and it's listening." So now, when a drifter, or a runaway, or a hunted-looking woman came by, Pritchard would grumble, just like he always had. But he would set a plate of hot beans on the counter, and he would not take their money. The high ridge of Confluence Ridge was silver in the moonlight. The new ditch, the one they had built together, was a shimmering, silver ribbon carrying life from the spring. Across the pasture, to the house, the land was healed from far, far away. Down in the canyon, the whistle of the Gila Pacific train could be heard, a faint, lonely cry, but it was distant now, a fading ghost. As the sound of the train died, a new sound rose to take its place, the sound of the wind, no longer screaming, but whispering, as it moved through the high, new grass. May and Ellis were home, but in New Mexico, in the high, cold mountains. A boy was walking toward Santa Fe, and when May Caldwell rode out to find him, with the long, dark shadow of the railroad, and the men Kells had left behind, rise up to meet her, the story, like the water, had only just begun. The next chapter will be Coyote Canyon, the Justice Hunt. Thank you so much for listening to this story. We would love to know where in the world you are listening from, so please drop a comment below and share your thoughts. Be sure to subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 like this video, and give us some extra support by hitting that hype button so more people can hear this tale.